In the corridors of privilege, secrets aren't whispered, they're weaponized. For months, palace staff had murmured of tension between the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales. But no one expected the stoic Princess Anne to be the one who finally shattered the silence and revealed Camilla's most cruel, cutting words about Kate Middleton, spoken in private but never forgotten. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The palace, with all its opulence and tradition, is also a fortress of unspoken truths. Over the past year, whispers had grown louder, small, seemingly insignificant observations stacking up like fragile china. A sideways glance during a procession, a curt nod at a diplomatic reception, a photo op where warmth felt like obligation. These weren't random moments, they were signals. Tensions between Camilla, Queen Consort, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were no longer just gossip, they were quietly escalating. But where others chose silence, Princess Anne chose resolve. Anne had long been the royal family's steel backbone, her loyalty unwavering, her discretion legendary. She didn't seek the spotlight, yet she commanded it when necessary. And this time, it was necessary. Something had changed. She had noticed the pattern, the shift in staff behavior, the quiet hesitations when Camilla's name was mentioned, and most notably, the protective way aides began to circle around Kate. Anne knew this wasn't about petty disagreements. It was about respect, legacy, and lines that had been crossed. Staff members who once prided themselves on staying neutral were visibly torn. Loyalty, once clearly owed to the institution, now felt fractured. Some gravitated toward Camilla, defending her rise and her role. Others, more quietly, began expressing unease, particularly around her treatment of Kate. Rumors swirled in hushed tones behind heavy doors. Not all could be substantiated, but one thread remained constant. Something cruel had been said. Something that didn't just reveal personal dislike but exposed a calculated disdain. It was in this fragile climate that Princess Anne began to pay closer attention. A brief exchange here, an overheard whisper there. The staff never spoke openly, but their eyes betrayed what their words could not. Anne's suspicions weren't formed in haste, they were forged in weeks of observation, quiet confirmations, and a gut instinct she'd honed over decades. The royal family had survived wars of protocol, scandal, and succession. But internal sabotage? That threatened the very heart of the monarchy. And Anne knew deep down that this wasn't just about Camilla and Kate. It was about history repeating itself. It was about learning from the shadows of Diana's legacy and refusing to let silence become complicity again. She had been silent once before. She would not be silent now. With the full weight of her position, her reputation, and her unshakable sense of justice, Princess Anne made her choice. The truth would not remain buried. But this wasn't a one-time comment. What Anne exposed had been building in the shadows for years, and its roots were far more vicious than anyone outside the palace imagined. It started as an offhand remark over afternoon tea, but what Camilla said to a group of trusted staff sent shockwaves through the royal household. The moment was meant to stay behind closed doors until someone broke, and what was heard would ignite a quiet fury in Princess Anne. It was a casual afternoon, the kind where the Queen Consort gathered with her closest aides, the atmosphere seemingly light, conversations flowing with practiced ease. But beneath the surface of those refined smiles, something darker stirred. Camilla, emboldened by her inner circle's loyalty, allowed her mask to slip. The comment, it seemed, wasn't rehearsed or calculated. It was instinctual, almost gleeful in its cruelty. As the conversation meandered toward public appearances and media coverage, Camilla leaned in and said, "Kate tries too hard. She's desperate to be adored. All performance, nothing real." The words hung in the air, slicing through the room with invisible precision. At first, no one reacted. A silence fell, sharp and uncomfortable. The staff had been trained for discretion, had internalized the unspoken rule. What happens in the royal inner chambers stays there. But this was different. Camilla's tone wasn't merely dismissive, it dripped with something deeper, a kind of quiet resentment. The way she spoke of Kate's popularity, her grace under pressure, Her magnetic connection to the public. It wasn't just commentary, it was contempt, veiled as humor, but edged with something cold and calculated. A few aides exchanged glances barely perceptible, their expressions unreadable. But one junior member, new to the team, felt the shift. She wasn't seasoned enough to ignore the chill that swept through the room, and certainly not cold-hearted enough to brush it off. That evening, she approached Anne's longtime equerry. The meeting was quiet, cloaked in hesitation, but the message was clear. Something had been said, something that shouldn't be buried. Princess Anne didn't react publicly. She didn't call a meeting or confront Camilla directly, not yet. But internally, something clicked. A line had been crossed, and she knew she had to confirm it. Over the next several days, she moved carefully, reaching out to a select few staff members she trusted implicitly. Each conversation confirmed more of the story: Camilla's mocking tone, her remarks about Kate's supposed insecurities, and a repeated line that lingered like a splinter: "She'll never be Diana, no matter how many children she bears." The weight of those words was impossible to ignore. Anne understood the implications not just for Kate, but for the stability of the monarchy itself. If Camilla, who now held one of the highest stations in the royal family, could so casually demean the woman married to the future king, what else was she saying behind the walls no one dared to breach? What other judgments had been passed in secrecy, festering beneath the polished veneer of unity? This wasn't petty jealousy or idle gossip. It was something deeper, a resentment that hinted at rivalry, even sabotage. And for Anne, who had stood by silently during other royal battles, who had watched Diana fight alone, and endured her own storms, this moment marked a shift. The betrayal wasn't hers, but she felt the cut as if it were. Camilla had underestimated the weight of her words, the power of the staff she assumed were hers, and above all the wrath of the one royal who never needed a crown to command fear. But Anne wasn't just reacting out of familial duty. What Camilla had said struck a nerve buried deep in royal history. Princess Anne isn't known for emotional outbursts, she's known for restraint, for loyalty to the crown overall. But when Camilla crossed a line, it triggered something far older in Anne: a protective instinct for the monarchy's true future, and a reckoning with her own silences. For decades, Anne had been the monarchy's unsung sentry, the quiet enforcer of protocol, order, and stability. She never chased headlines, never courted public sympathy, but within palace walls, she was respected and feared for her clarity, her refusal to play games, and her ability to see straight through people. That clarity, once again, was needed, because this time, the rot wasn't coming from outside the institution, it was internal, and it was threatening everything Anne had spent her life protecting. The disrespect toward Kate, the mockery from someone now crowned queen, wasn't just unkind, it was dangerous. It risked fracturing the very image of unity the royals depended on. And worse, it threatened to repeat a painful history Anne had already lived through once. Years ago, it had been Diana, the people's princess, the outsider who was never truly embraced by the establishment. Anne had seen it firsthand, the coldness, the whispers, the invisible line Diana was never allowed to cross. And while Anne never openly championed Diana during those turbulent years, she never joined in the cruelty either. But the regret lingered. She had stayed silent, too loyal to the system to challenge it. And when Diana fell, publicly and tragically, part of Anne was left haunted by the consequences of silence. Now, with Kate poised, dignified, and carrying the future of the monarchy on her shoulders, the echoes were too loud to ignore. Camilla's words weren't just about jealousy or rivalry. To Anne, they revealed something more corrosive, a bitterness that threatened to divide the royal women again. And his time, Anne wouldn't be a passive observer. She owed it to Kate, to the memory of Diana, and to the monarchy itself. Anne didn't storm into Camilla's quarters or seek a dramatic confrontation. That wasn't her style. Instead, she quietly summoned two senior staff members, individuals known for their long service, their discretion, and their access. The meetings were brief, surgical. Anne didn't need gossip, she needed confirmation. And she got it. What Camilla had said wasn't hearsay, it was truth. Cold, calculated, and repeated in tones of superiority. The dismissals of Kate's smiling performance, the jabs at her sincerity, the unflinching comparison to Diana. It was all real. That sealed it. Anne made her decision, not out of vengeance, but out of duty. If the monarchy was to survive the next generation, it could not be poisoned from within. The image of unity had to mean something again, and that meant holding Camilla accountable, even if the repercussions threatened to split the family in two. For Anne, the choice wasn't easy, but it was clear. The silence would break, and the palace would feel it. And so, Anne began laying the groundwork for an exposure that would ripple through every corner of Buckingham Palace. "She's just a performer in pearls." Those were the words, cold, mocking, and laced with disdain. Camilla's alleged comment about Kate wasn't merely catty, it was character assassination. And now Anne was about to make sure the world knew exactly what had been said, and by whom. The testimonies came quietly, but with remarkable consistency. From different departments, different ranks, and different rooms of the palace, the same phrases kept surfacing, haunting in their repetition. Camilla hadn't simply let slip a stray insult. She had, according to multiple members of staff, built an entire narrative behind closed doors. The Queen Consort, confident that her words would never escape the thick walls of Buckingham Palace, had described the Princess of Wales as too soft for the job, a woman who smiles because she's afraid to speak, and calculating behind the charm. But it was that single line, the one repeated almost verbatim across every account, that hit hardest. She'll never have what Diana had, and she knows it. To those who served in silence, it was a betrayal of the image the public had come to believe. They had seen Kate behind the scenes, kind, composed, quietly resilient. The suggestion that her poise was an act, her grace a manipulation, didn't align with what they knew, and yet fear kept most of them quiet. In the royal household, hierarchy wasn't just about title, it was about survival. To speak out against the Queen Consort, even indirectly, was to risk career and reputation. Still, the ripple had begun. One testimony became 2, then 5, then 9, and as the weight of these statements reached Princess Anne, her course became clear. Anne didn't act out of impulse, she moved with calculated intent. Every recollection was cross-checked, every quote verified through overlapping sources. She wanted accuracy, not drama. But what she uncovered wasn't just a pattern of cruelty, it was a campaign. Camilla had used her private moments not to build up the future queen, but to tear her down, and the staff had seen it, felt it, carried it. One even recalled how Camilla had once scoffed during a debrief, whispering, "Kate learned from Diana, but she'll never be Diana." Another remembered a sarcastic laugh when Kate's popularity was mentioned. "Let her have the tabloids. I have the crown." Anne's fury didn't manifest in shouting or spectacle. It hardened into resolve. She had watched Diana be vilified in the shadows of the very palace she served. She would not watch history repeat itself. Kate may have been the target, but it was the entire future of the monarchy that stood to suffer. If these words, this bitterness, were allowed to fester, it would rot the royal image from the inside out. Anne knew there would be consequences, repercussions. But silence this time would be complicity. She prepared for what was to come, not just the internal backlash, but the storm that would erupt once the truth began to seep beyond the palace walls. Her mission was not vengeance, it was justice. For Kate, for Diana, for every woman in the royal household forced to smile through betrayal. And as Anne stepped into the role, no one expected her to take the role of exposer. She did so with a fight. No crown could extinguish, but exposing the truth would come at a price, and Anne knew exactly who would come after her. When Camilla heard that Anne had gone public discreetly, but unmistakably, the Queen Consort's fury was uncontainable. What followed wasn't a denial, it was a campaign, quiet, brutal, and aimed straight at Anne standing in the palace hierarchy. Camilla didn't shout, she didn't make a scene. But her silence was strategic, her response rehearsed. Publicly, she waved off the rumors, painting herself as misunderstood, even wounded. Behind the scenes, though, she launched a carefully controlled retaliation. The goal wasn't to challenge Anne head-on, it was to chip away at her influence piece by piece until she stood isolated. The inner circle was activated. Long-serving aides, loyal to Camilla, began a whisper campaign designed not to confront but to corrode. Stories were fed to trusted insiders that Anne had overstepped, that she was unstable, even jealous. They framed her actions not as noble but personal, desperate, the last gasp of a woman out of step with the times. Suddenly, Anne's calendar began to shift. Invitations that once came automatically were now accidentally omitted. Ceremonial roles she had held for decades were quietly reassigned, often to younger royals, or worse, to Camilla herself. There were no official statements, no public confrontations. But the message was clear: Anne was being pushed to the margins. She had broken an unspoken rule: never expose your own, and now she would pay the price. The palace, for all its grandeur, operates like a chessboard, and Camilla was moving her pieces ruthlessly. Charles found himself caught in an impossible position. On one side stood his sister, the woman who had protected the royal institution with unwavering devotion. On the other, his wife, the queen consort, who now threatened to unravel the family from within if not carefully managed. He tried to mediate, to keep things contained, but his indecision only deepened the fracture. His reluctance to challenge Camilla became its own statement. Anne saw it, understood it, and felt the sting not just as a sister, but as a soldier of the crown being silently dismissed. The press began to murmur. Headlines hinted at tension between the royal women. Frost behind the throne, one article teased. Two queens in waiting, another declared, referring to Anne's legacy and Kate's destiny. But the palace, as always, issued no comment. The public only saw coordinated appearances and polite smiles. Yet behind those layers of diplomacy, the war was raging. A cold, quiet conflict that didn't need shouting to destroy reputations. But Anne didn't fight back with press leaks or public defiance. She remained silent, not out of fear but out of strategy. Because while Camilla believed she was isolating her opponent, Anne was observing, waiting, preparing. She knew palace games. She had grown up in the very system Camilla Boyu, as now trying to bend. And if Camilla thought this would break her, she had grossly underestimated the resolve of the one woman in the family who had never needed public favor to wield quiet power. In public, they smiled. But behind those palace walls, a cold war had begun, and Anne had just lit the fuse. For years, Kate Middleton had mastered the art of silence. But when Princess Anne brought the truth into the light, something inside Kate cracked. And in one deeply personal conversation overheard by someone very unexpected, she revealed exactly how Camilla's words had wounded her. Beneath the poised elegance, behind every graceful wave and polished smile, Kate had carried a quiet burden, one she had never dared to voice. She had accepted her role with dignity, worn expectation like a second skin, and endured whispers with unflinching grace. But the relentless scrutiny, the unspoken comparisons to Diana, and now Camilla's brutal betrayal, it had left fractures that no tiara could hide. And for the first time, Kate allowed herself to speak, not as a duchess or a future queen, but as a woman who had been deeply, cruelly hurt. It happened in a quiet corner of the palace, far from flashing cameras and official schedules. A senior staffer, one who had served both Diana and Kate, found her alone, seated in silence. What began as a moment of awkward politeness turned into a confession that had long been sealed inside. Kate's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the way. "I tried so hard to be enough," she said, the words slipping out like breath she had held for years. "I thought if I was perfect, if I smiled, if I followed every rule, they'd see me for who I am. But it's never been enough. Not for her." She didn't need to say Camilla's name. It was already there, heavy, in the room. The staffer remained still, not out of protocol, but out of reverence. Because this was not a royal moment. It was a human one. And in that moment, Kate spoke not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever tried to fit into a world that had already decided her worth. She spoke of Diana not in sadness, but in reflection. She had courage, even when they turned on her. "I've always wondered, would she have survived this version of the palace?" Unbeknownst to Kate, she wasn't entirely alone. Just beyond the door, Princess Anne had paused. She hadn't meant to overhear, But what she heard changed everything. She had fought this battle before and lost someone in the process. This time, she wouldn't let history consume another soul. The heartbreak in Kate's voice wasn't weakness. It was honesty. And in it, Anne found a renewed sense of purpose. Camilla's words hadn't just wounded Kate. They had exposed a rot that threatened to undermine everything the monarchy claimed to stand for. What made the moment even more devastating was the knowledge that William knew. He had known pieces, sensed the pain, but had been trapped between duty and protection. His silence wasn't betrayal, it was paralysis. The same system that demanded his loyalty had bound his hands. And Kate, ever the loyal wife, never asked him to choose. But Anne saw it all. The quiet implosions, the unspoken anguish, and it only hardened her resolve. Meanwhile, to the public, everything appeared intact. The smiles were rehearsed, the photos immaculate. But beneath the royal surface, a storm was gathering strength, one built not on scandal, but on truth, a truth that could no longer be ignored. Because this time, the pain wasn't whispered behind closed doors, it was real, it was visible. And it was about to change everything. And just as the royal family tried to contain the damage, one final unexpected twist emerged from someone no one saw coming. He had remained the peacemaker until now. Prince William, forced to watch his wife be quietly humiliated and his aunt maligned, finally stepped into the fray, and when he did, his ultimatum to his father would shake the very core of the monarchy's succession plan. For weeks, William had tried to hold the line. He had listened, absorbed, waited, believing perhaps it would pass, that tensions would cool and protocol would prevail. But with every report, every whispered confirmation of Camilla's calculated words and Anne's deliberate sidelining, a storm began to build within him. He could stomach criticism, he could survive scandal, but he would not allow the woman he loved, the future Queen of England, to be dismantled from within the very family she had served with such unwavering grace. When the full extent of Camilla's actions reached him, the remarks, the staff manipulation, the subtle erasure of Anne from ceremonial life, something snapped. This wasn't family politics anymore. It was sabotage. Behind the gilded doors of Clarence House, William confronted his father in a meeting that was neither warm nor restrained. There were no formalities, no measured tones, just the raw voice of a son, a husband, and a future king whose patience had finally reached its end. "This ends now," William told Charles, his words not a request but a declaration. There was no ambiguity, no compromise. The message was simple: choose a path, because neutrality was no longer an option. For a man trained to temper every conflict, this was a break in character. And for Charles, it was a choice he had never wanted to make. Charles stood between two forces. He could no longer balance: the wife who had become his enduring ally and the son who embodied the monarchy's entire future. Torn, he hesitated, and that hesitation cost him. William, sensing the cracks, pushed further. He made it clear that if this campaign against Kate and Anne continued, he would begin withdrawing from public duties. Quietly, effectively, and without apology. No press briefings, no drama, just absence, the kind that would spark questions the palace wasn't prepared to answer. The palace machine scrambled. Courtiers rush to smooth over appearances. Phone calls were made, calendars were adjusted. Internally, teams were deployed to prevent the implosion from leaking beyond the palace walls. But they were already too late. The shift in power had begun. Because William's silence had once been their shield, his compliance their strategy. But now that silence had turned into resolve, and with it came a realization that changed everything. The heir was no longer waiting. He was leading. For the first time, those closest to the throne understood that the monarchy's survival didn't lie in tradition, it lay in transformation. William wasn't just reacting to a personal slight. He was defending the credibility of the institution he would one day inherit. And by doing so, he had redrawn the lines of influence within the palace. No longer was Camilla untouchable. No longer was Anne expendable. And no longer would Kate be left to endure alone. But as the men of the monarchy negotiated power, the women were already changing the course of history in their own way. In a world ruled by crowns and cameras, trust is the rarest currency. But out of betrayal came an unexpected alliance. Princess Anne and the Princess of Wales, two women from vastly different eras, forged a silent pact to protect the monarchy and each other. Their meeting wasn't scheduled, nor was it announced. It happened away from the handlers and advisors, away from the watchers and whisperers. Just two women bound not by titles, but by ours. Anne, hardened by a lifetime of restraint, had seen it all: the rise and fall of royals, the weaponization of silence, and the cruelty of being born into duty rather than choice. Kate, still composed but changed by the bruises of betrayal, no longer sought protection. She sought understanding. What passed between them wasn't lengthy. It didn't need to be. It was a shared look, a moment of unspoken recognition, and finally words that mattered. Strength isn't about silence, Anne told her. It's about survival. You don't have to play their game to win it. And from that moment, something shifted in Kate. The need to be liked began to dissolve. The desperation to appease was replaced by something sharper, a resolve forged not in approval, but in truth. She began to walk with a different kind of grace, not one built for the public, but one carved out of pain. Anne's guidance wasn't about rebellion, it was about resilience. The quiet message was clear: power wasn't given in the royal family. It was taken, often invisibly, by those who refused to vanish. The change didn't go unnoticed. During appearances, Anne and Kate were seen standing closer. Their glances carried weight, their interactions, once distant, now laced with warmth. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The monarchy's past and future were aligned. And the woman once accused of being too meek to lead was now leading without asking permission. Kate had stopped waiting for permission to belong. She had earned her place not through proximity to power, but through endurance. Meanwhile, Camilla began to feel the chill of her own making. Her circle, once tight and unwavering, began to fray. There were murmurs of disappointment, whispers that perhaps she had gone too far. The narrative she had tried to shape unraveled, thread by thread. Her comments, once buried, had become her own undoing. And in the palace corridors, where loyalty once bent to her title, neutrality now reigned. The shift wasn't explosive, it was quiet, but devastating. What Anne and Kate had formed wasn't just a bond. It was a statement that women in the House of Windsor could no longer be reduced to pawns or props. They would no longer be silenced by hierarchy or history. They would reshape the institution not with rebellion, but with resolve. The palace had entered a new era, one not defined by who wore the crown, but by who refused to bow to manipulation. An era written not in scandal, but in solidarity. But even as the dust settled, the scars remained, and one final revelation would expose just how deeply Camilla's words had cut. The world may never fully hear the private truths spoken behind palace walls, but the consequences are unfolding in plain sight. As Camilla retreats from public view, and Anne's stature quietly rises, the monarchy faces a reckoning not of scandal but of character. In the weeks that followed, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla's presence began to recede from the spotlight. Engagements once highlighted in royal circulars were now quietly reassigned. Public appearances became fewer, interviews rarer, and when she did step out, the warmth seemed rehearsed, the reception colder. It wasn't punishment, it was repositioning. A carefully managed narrative began to take shape, one that framed the Queen Consort as stepping back to allow others to lead, as if it had been her idea all along. But those who paid attention saw through it. This was no graceful exit, it was retreat disguised as dignity. In contrast, Princess Anne stepped into the void without ceremony or fanfare. Her role didn't change on paper, but her presence did. She became a quiet force beside the throne, her voice suddenly carrying more weight in internal matters. Her advice, once sought for tradition, was now valued for strategy. Within the palace, aides spoke of her with renewed respect. She wasn't ascending, she was stabilizing. The monarchy had weathered yet another internal storm, and it was Anne who held the line when others faltered. As for Kate, the media began to reshape the narrative surrounding her. Where once commentators questioned her silence, they now praised her restraint. Her composure was no longer mistaken for compliance, but reframed as resilience. Headlines spoke of the steely princess and Kate's quiet power, a woman who endured the worst and never lost grace. Sympathy poured in from the public, not just because she had been wronged, but because she had risen without asking for revenge. She became, without trying, the moral compass of the royal family, dignified, loyal, and unbreakable. And in the middle of it all stood Charles, pulled between the woman he loved and the legacy he was bound to protect. The choice had never been his to control. Not really. He had tried to juggle loyalty, image, and power, and found himself losing control of all three. The women around him had reshaped the palace dynamic without ever stepping outside protocol. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their actions and their truths had spoken louder than any royal decree. The House of Windsor had survived yet another tremor, but not without consequence. The trust once assumed between its highest members had fractured. The illusion of unity was cracked. And while the family might pose together again for photographs, something had changed beneath the surface permanently. The cost of silence had been exposed, and those who once wielded quiet cruelty now stood in its shadow. And as a new royal chapter begins, the question remains, how many more secrets are still buried behind those palace doors? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.